Andrew Wilson, Ukraine Crisis, What It Means for the West. In the book Ukraine Crisis, What It Means for the West, by Andrew Wilson, the complexities of Ukraine's political and economic struggles are unraveled as it lies at the crossroads between Russia and Western Europe. The summary takes you through a historical analysis of Russia's interventions in Ukraine, its dependence on Russian gas and oil, and Moscow's influence on certain Ukrainian politicians. Moreover, it covers the significance of the European Union and NATO in the region, Putin's power play strategies, and the corruption plaguing Ukraine. By the end, the conflict in eastern Ukraine and its impact on global politics come into focus.
Ukraine's geopolitical struggle. Ukraine's location between Russia and Western Europe has led to political and economic struggles. Russia has a long history of intervention and could easily drive Ukraine into bankruptcy by raising fossil fuel prices. Europe seeks to strengthen Ukraine's ties but also depends on Russia's fossil fuel supply, while NATO expands eastward and Russia tries to guard its former sphere of influence. The European Union's strategy of ignoring Ukraine's predicament has only worsened the situation. Putin's rise to power. This summary details how Vladimir Putin rose to power and became a dominating figure in the Russian government. Despite formalities, Russia is still far from embracing democracy. Undemocratic practices such as bribery, censorship, and political thought suppression still thrive under Putin's regime. Putin manipulates elections and suppresses anyone who opposes him while using funding to support those who aid in his agenda. The government also works to silence journalists who attempt to reveal the regime's wrongdoing. Putin manipulates Russians both at home and abroad, and spends billions on public relations campaigns targeted towards neighboring countries, such as Ukraine, to strengthen his domestic and international influence. Putin embraces manipulative and coercive means to maintain power and control in the Russian government. Ukraine's struggle for democracy. Ukraine gained independence in 1991 after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it appeared the country was ready for a democratic government. However, corruption was rampant, and the government was too weak to control organized crime. Oligarchs, clans, and mafia groups heavily influenced the country's politics, which opened a door for Russian elites to fund them. Viktor Yanukovych unlawfully won the 2004 presidential election, leading to mass protests known as the Orange Revolution. Although the Ukrainian Supreme Court annulled the election, corruption still persisted in the country. Yanukovych eventually became president in 2010, and corruption became a way of life in the democratic system that had broken down. The European Union never intervened, leaving Ukraine to continue to struggle with its democratic processes. Ukraine's path to reformation. In 2008, Ukraine and the European Union began negotiating a free trade agreement, but the European Union required Ukraine to sign an association agreement to dismantle corruption. Ukrainian President Yanukovych declined, fearing it would harm his standing with the government's funding. In 2013, Yanukovych's Russian-backed government refused the agreement, sparking protests in the Maidan. When Yanukovych's government troops intervened, protests grew to a point where the European Union intervened and offered a second deal, which Yanukovych ultimately accepted. The more democratic Ukrainian constitution was temporarily reinstated, and Yanukovych fled to Russia with an estimated $32 billion. Crimea Annexation. After the Ukrainian people ousted their corrupt leader, their hopes for a brighter future were short-lived. Russia's Putin took the opportunity to annex Crimea, justifying his actions by claiming that over half of its residents identified as Russian. With a weak national defense, Ukraine had no power to respond as only 60 soldiers, armed with Kalashnikov rifles, ensured a referendum to confirm Russian rule. Putin's sights were then set on the Donbass region. Putin's quest for control. After annexing Crimea for Russia, Putin sets his sights on the Donbass region of Ukraine. Claiming that Russian speakers were being discriminated against, Putin launched a propaganda campaign to gain support for the pro-Russian rebellion. While the takeover of the Donbass was not as successful as Putin had hoped, the conflict between Ukrainian forces and pro-Russian rebels persists to this day. The tragic downing of a Malaysian Airlines plane only added fuel to the fire. Despite attempts at outside diplomacy, the fighting has yet to be resolved. The global implications of Ukraine crisis. The crisis in Ukraine has far-reaching effects beyond the region as it has worsened the relationship between Russia and the West. As a result of Russia's annexation of Crimea, the EU and the US imposed sanctions on Russia, and in response, Putin imposed an embargo on food imports. Putin aims to expand Russia's influence by re-establishing ties with former Soviet states, which could lead to similar crises in other countries in Russia's perceived sphere of influence. As the EU lacks military forces and the ability to defend Ukrainian sovereignty, countries such as Moldova, Georgia, the Baltic states, Belarus, Armenia, or Azerbaijan could face violent conflicts. The crisis also confirms Putin's motivation to reassert an alliance and expand Russia's influence. The effect of the Ukrainian crisis on global politics is yet to be determined, but it is clear that it affects more than just the citizens of Ukraine.
The book's summary effectively dissects the myriad complications that constitute the ongoing Ukraine crisis. It articulately explains the political and economic factors at play, including Russia's manipulation of the Ukrainian government, the EU's increasing power in the region, and the prevalence of corruption in Ukraine. Furthermore, it addresses the internal and external influences exploitable by the Russian government to gain power and control. Additionally, you learn about the current conflict in eastern Ukraine, the role of international diplomacy, and the potential for further crises to arise in other states within Russia's sphere of influence. Overall, this concise summary allows readers to grasp the complex web of factors contributing to the Ukraine crisis, and how it stands to affect global politics.